Okay, so today we're going to be talking about the Iranian Revolution, and did the Iranian Revolution improve the lives of the Iranians? And then we're also going to be talking about the Iran-Iraq War, which occurs after, almost immediately after the Iranian Revolution. So first off, actually, let me go back to this for a second. I want you to think about, why would the U.S. want to make sure that the Middle East is politically stable? Because we have kind of a role in this inadvertently, and it leads to some of the reasons why there's resentment between us and Iran. So the first question is, why was there unrest in the country of Iran? So first, just to give you a location. So Iran is kind of in between the Middle East and South Asia, because it's in between Iraq and Afghanistan and Pakistan. It's on the Persian Gulf, the Caspian Sea, and the Gulf of Oman. So first off, oil was discovered in this region, or in Persia, in 1908. So the Turkish Petroleum Company was founded in 1911. That was to drill for oil in Mosul, which is in Iraq. So the British are going to sign a secret agreement with the Sheikh of Kuwait, who, while outwardly pledging allegiance to the Ottoman Sultan, promised to give oil rights to the British. So prior to the war, World War I, Kuwait becomes a British protectorate. In 1927, oil was struck in Kirkuk, Iraq, and the Iraqi Petroleum Company was created. So we see that one of the major reasons why the Middle East is such an important region is because of its oil reserves. And here we can see in this map, this is the oil fields that Iran has. So we can see in the western part of the country, it has quite a bit of oil reserves, particularly in these areas here. And also, this area here is also always like a flashpoint. This is the Strait of Hormuz, because a lot of the oil comes out of Kuwait, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, comes through the Persian Gulf, goes through the Strait of Hormuz, out into the Gulf of Oman, Arabian Sea, Indian Ocean. And so sometimes here, the Iranians try to close off the Strait of Hormuz, so that's like a very important area to have control over. So, oil really is going to become, especially as we move forward into the 1900s and we start to see things like cars and automobiles and all these different things that start to run on oil, it's going to be very important to make sure that you can safeguard your access to oil. So oil becomes the new international coin of the realm, and we start to see that U.S. oil companies begin to kind of gain concessions in the region. Now, as far as Iran, so this man here, Reza Khan, he was an Iranian officer. He's going to seize control of the government in 1921, declares himself Shah in 1925, and created the Pahlavi dynasty. He rules from 1925 to 1941, 1925 to 1941. He did initiate some modern reforms, but he was forced to abdicate by the Allied armies in 1941. What we do start to see, though, but he is the founder of the Pahlavi dynasty, we do start to see some reforms developing in Iran. We start to see the secularization of the country. We see an adoption of the French Civil Code, the building of the Trans-Iranian Railroad, and we do start to see improved education. So during World War II, the British forced the abdication of Reza Khan in favor of his son, who was more pro-British, and his name was Reza Pahlavi. So Reza Pahlavi is going to rule from 1941 until 1977. So under the Shah, Iran was the richest country in the Middle East, and most of that money was coming in because of the exploitation of the oil reserves in the country. The per capita income had increased, literacy was improving, a middle class was beginning to emerge in Iran. However, the majority of the people were still living in poverty, and any of his dissidents were brutally suppressed by the Savak, which was his police force. In 1951, this man, Mohammad, Mossadegh, becomes the prime minister of Iran. He began to nationalize the foreign oil industries, even though this was against what the Shah wanted. He got rid of the corrupt military officials, but he was toppled by a coup aided by America in 1953, and the Shah returns to power. Because the minute you start to see the nationalization of oil companies, everyone's immediately assuming that this is going to be a movement towards communism. So here is the Shah and his wife Farah. So the Iranian upper classes, they were very elite, they were very pro-Western. There's the Shah with a whole bunch of American presidents, so he was a close ally with very, there's Kennedy, there's Carter, there's Nixon, there he is again with Jimmy Carter. So there was a very close relationship between the two. So under what's referred to as the White Revolution, the Shah begins to initiate a reform program. So 90% of Iran's peasants became landowners. We see a massive government-financed heavy industry projects. Women were granted more political power and had the right to vote. Money was put into education, especially in the rural areas where literacy was very high. We start to see profit sharing and the nationalizations of forests and pasture land. So we do see that the government was making movements towards trying to reform the system. Now, despite that, though, there's still going to be a great deal of unrest, and the Shah is eventually going to be overthrown. Part of this is because the Shah spent his oil profits for the top-of-the-line American military hardware. He's spending money on all sorts of military things, really not investing the money back into the Iranian economy. The religious leaders were angry with the Shah because they felt that the country was just too westernized and that they had moved too far away from the kind of basic Muslim values, in essence. So the government was very corrupt. In one instance, like the 1000th anniversary of the Persian Empire, he had this huge, massive party where they had like vats of caviar. They just spent all this ridiculous amount of money, and a lot of people were still suffering and still poor, and they're kind of looking at this like, why is the government wasting so much money on these things? So it was a great deal of corruption amongst the government, and the Shah basically did not again allow any sort of dissidents to grow within the country. So that was really a violation of the basic human rights of the citizen. So he wasn't necessarily that popular. The peasants were still landless. Unemployment amongst intellectuals, the educated class, was still very high. There were still very high levels of inflation. Many people from the countryside were moving into the cities, and that was putting a really big strain on the infrastructure of Iran. There were food shortages and shortages of basic necessities. The conservative leaders, like I said, opposed the Shah's excesses. They thought this corruption was not warranted, and they opposed the Shah because they thought the Shah was too Western. So we start to see that the opposition begins to use terrorism to express their discontent, and many of the opponents, who were mostly students, were pursued, were jailed, and were tortured to death. And we see this kind of basically this ratcheting up of violence where there's a protest, someone shot. At the funeral, there's another protest, someone shot. It's just this ratcheting up of violence that we see. And so here you can see this is a pulling down of the statue of the Shah. This is a burning of the pictures of the Shah and his wife. And this is the attacking of the embassies. You can see that the major opponents of the Shah were the oil field workers, the students, middle-class businessmen, Iranian nationalists, and Muslim clerics. And this is Iranian students protesting in Beverly Hills. And a lot of this, because the Shah was so hated in Iran and we were supporting the Shah, we get kind of linked to this. So as a result of all the anarchy and revolution that kind of occurs, the Shah is forced to leave Iran in 1979. And there you see the Shah leaving the country. So the question is, how did the Ayatollah Khomeini come to power? So when the Shah leaves power in Iran, it wasn't 100% clear who was going to govern Iran. Many people who lived outside of Iran came back to Iran because this was a very hopeful moment in its history, thinking that anything was possible. Maybe a democracy could happen, better government. So many people who had left the country came back hoping for a better country. So now the Ayatollah, he lived from 1902 to 1989. He was an Islamic scholar, studied in the holy city of Qom. He began to speak out against the Shah in the 1960s. He had been arrested and imprisoned several times, and he had been deported in 1978 and was in France. He kept in contact with the dissidents, and he referred to the Iranian government as the satanic regime. So when all of this unrest happens in Iran, and the Shah basically is forced to abdicate and leave the country, in 1979, Khomeini was allowed to return to Iran. He led a popular demonstration with as many as 5 million people, and a theocracy is created in Iran. So members of the Savak suspects were taken, Shah's generals were put on trial and were executed. In the first 2 years, about 800 people were executed and thousands of people were exiled. So here you can see he returns to Iran February 11th, 1979. And here you can see the Iranian woman with it on the cover. So a theocracy is created. Savak suspects are taken. Here we see some of the Shah's generals who had been executed. Here we see when the devil leaves, the angel returns, so pushing the Shah out of the country. Also what happens during this time period is the U.S. Embassy in Tehran is taken over, partly to express the anger over the Shah being allowed to come to the United States. The Shah had cancer at this point, and he was allowed to come to the United States to go to Sloan Kettering to receive cancer treatment. And the Iranian people were enraged by that because they felt that the Shah, who had been so brutal to them, had been backed by the Americans. So the American embassy is taken over. 52 Americans are held hostage for 444 days, and they're finally released in January of 1981. So here you can see one of them, one of the American embassy workers kind of being forced to be on TV. Here you can see them being kind of like paraded on the Iranian government. And they finally were released January 1981, which is actually the day that President Reagan was inaugurated. So President Carter really wasn't able to negotiate the release, and he lost the election of 1980 because of it. And the hostages, like I said, were released on the day that he leaves office, on the day that President Reagan is inaugurated. So now the question becomes, how did life for the Iranians change under the Ayatollah? Did it become what the Iranians had hoped for? So the new government was dominated by Shi'ites who introduced Sharia or Islamic law into Iran. Constitutional parties, leftist parties, meaning more leaning towards communism, that were all repressed. So they only allowed one political party. Moderate leaders were replaced by radical religious leaders who basically obeyed Khomeini's every command. Any influences of the U.S. and Western Europe were purged. They also distanced themselves from communism and from atheism. Strict Islamic legal codes were put into place. So punishments for things such as amputation for theft, stoning for women who were caught in adultery. There was a great deal of legal restrictions being placed on women based on religious principles. So women in Iran had to wear the chador, which you could see in this picture here. But you could see kind of the progression of Iranian women. Originally, prior to the Ayatollah coming to power, many Iranian women didn't veil. They dressed in very Western styles, and that becomes suppressed over time. They have to wear the chador. They're not allowed to be seen on the street without the shawl and the headscarf. The Islamic legal authority controls marriage, divorce, child custody, and their right to work. Many women's career prospects were severely limited. Originally, most women accepted this as a stand against Western culture and Western imperialism. Literacy rates amongst women did rise from 59% to 70%, and 95% of women in Iran go to primary school. Birth rates did drop. So from 49, so birth rates did drop, literacy rates did increase. So families shrank, which made life easier for women. So it's kind of like feminism and nationalism and religion are kind of intertwined and it doesn't really fit any other stereotype except for what happens in Iran. Now, the revolution and the religious fervor that came up as a result of this really was a surprise to the West. Many thought the Iranians had approved of the Shah and his reforms, and were kind of very surprised how against the Shah the people were. But there are police on the street that patrol to make sure that the women are following in line with the various different restrictions that are placed on women in the country. Some people will say that one dictatorship was replaced with another dictatorship. This definitely increased the instability of the Middle East. It inspired religious dissidents to attack the Great Mosque in Mecca during the Hajj in 1979, trying to trigger revolt against the Saudi government. In Egypt in 1981, militants linked to Iran assassinate President Anwar Sadat. In 1989, a British citizen who was an Indian-born Muslim author, Salman Rushdie, wrote a book called The Satanic Verses. He was declared a heretic, and there was a fatwa, or a religious decree, marked on him for execution. And there was a $5 million bounty placed on his head. So we start to see kind of like destabilization in the area. Western hostages were seized in other Middle Eastern countries, and the Iranians really supported the Palestinian cause, funding various different organizations within the Middle East. This is the first anniversary of the Islamic Revolution. So how was the Iran changed with the death of the Ayatollah Khomeini? So the new Ayatollah was this man. Now the Ayatollah represents the fundamentalist mullahs within the country. They do have a secular government, well, not secular, but they do have a separate government where people are elected president, but they can't run for president without approval from the Ayatollah. So he is the Ayatollah Khatami. The various different Ayatollahs, he's considered to be a little more politically moderate. Some of them are a little more politically extreme. However, they support the Shiites, in Iraq. But we are starting to see a pushback against them. We are starting to see a pushback against this, partly because many of the young people in society are beginning to demand more political rights. In 2005, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad was elected president. He had actually tried to deny the Holocaust and say it didn't happen. He also started the nuclear program in Iran. So that's another big issue that's happening right now. The U.S. is in talks trying to stop the Iranians from progressing and building towards a nuclear Iran. No one really in the world wants a nuclear Iran because they feel that it would be very unstable for the region. But we have an increasingly younger members of society who are beginning to demand more rights. In 2009, Ahmadinejad ran for re-election, and his results were disputed. And a lot of people felt that the challenger, Mossadegh, really had won. And this led to a series of uprisings that was known as the Green Revolution or the Twitter Revolution. Green was the color of the political party. And the reason why it was called the Twitter Revolution is because people were communicating over social media to organize for the revolts. And actually, Twitter was supposed to be doing like a system maintenance during this uprisings, and the State Department actually asked them to not go down because the only way that they were monitoring the situation was through Twitter. This revolution, though, or uprising, I should say, was very brutally put down. Most famously, there was a woman who was actually shot and died on national TV. So that was very brutally put down. Dissident, like again, is still not allowed in Iran. So the people try to push back against it, and they're kind of stopped. Now, the other topic I wanted to talk about, and unfortunately my PowerPoint is broken and won't open for this, but pretty much immediately after Iran has its revolution, it is invaded by its neighboring country of Iraq. So why did Saddam actually decide, it was under Saddam Hussein, why was the decision to invade Iran? So just to give you a little bit of background on Iraq, Iraq becomes a country in 1921. It's from 3 separate Ottoman provinces, Mosul, Baghdad, and Basra. It gained its formal independence from Britain in 1932. And the British during World War I and World War II really maintained the military bases in Iraq because the oil that Iraq had was helping the Allies in World War II. The monarchy that was set up in Iraq was very, very weak. We see 7 military coups between 1936 and 1941. In 1958, there's a revolution and the monarchy is overthrown, and we see the creation of the Republic of Iraq. What we then see is a dictatorship in Iraq where the Western advisors are purged, government is centralized, and there were some land reform and public welfare projects. And violence becomes a major part of the Iraqi political culture. So in 1952, in Iraq, we see the creation of what's called the Ba'ath Party. The Ba'ath Party is going to be the party of Saddam Hussein. And Saddam Hussein is going to, there's going to be a major military coup amongst the Ba'ath Party in 1963. And in 1979, Saddam Hussein is going to become president. He created the Republican Guard, which was his elite security force, and he's going to purge any government dissidents. So now, Iran and Iraq do not have a friendly relationship with each other because Iran is Shiite Islam and the Iraqi government is Sunni Islam, even though most of the people in in Iraq actually practice Shiite Islam. So the Iraqis feared that there would be a Shiite revolution and that this would spread to Iraq when the Iranian Revolution occurred. So also in the mid-70s, Iran was supporting a Kurdish rebellion in Iraq, and Iraq did not appreciate that. They share a border, and that provides them both access to the Persian Gulf. And the borders, of course, do not really follow ethnic boundaries. So basically, Saddam took advantage over the turmoil in the Iranian Revolution and invades Iran on September 22nd, 1980. Originally, the war was going well for Iraq, and then the tide turned towards Iran. The Iraqis used chemical weapons against the Iranians and the Kurds. Iran attacked Kuwaiti oil tankers in the Persian Gulf. Everyone in the international community was pretty much against Iran, and we were actually supporting Iraq in this fight. About 375,000 Iraqi casualties, about 60,000 POWs, and 1 million Iranian casualties. It was a UN-mandated ceasefire that ended the war. There was no formal agreement, and both sides held POWs. So the war never really, it just kind of like they just agreed to stop fighting. Iraq then sets his eyes on Kuwait. So Kuwait is a country just south of Iraq. And in the 1990s, Iraq invades Kuwait to try to claim their oil fields. And this led to what refers to as Operation Desert Storm, where many people ganged up on, not ganged up, but fought against Iraq to force them out of Kuwait. And there was also fears that Iraq was going to invade Saudi Arabia. And Iraq, in an attempt to gain support amongst their Muslim neighbors, began bombing Israel to try to turn it against a war against Israel, which he was unsuccessful. So we also then go to war with Iraq again in 2003 as a result of 9/11 and the idea that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, which we know, of course, Iraq did not actually have. And in that war, Saddam Hussein was overthrown, and we are still having tons of instability and problems in Iraq today because they're still torn apart by factional violence between the Shiites and the Sunnis. So that kind of gives you kind of a very quick, probably to you not that quick, but a rundown of what was going on in Iran and Iraq through the 1980s, 1990s.